Hi, it's Mr. Sato. Let's talk about realism. Strictly speaking, realism isn't modern. It has long roots in history. But the realism I'm talking about in this video started to happen in the 1800s, before World War I, so it precedes modernism. Dickens and Tolstoy were realists. It was a reaction against Romanticism. Check out my video on that topic. Realism was depicting the world in ways that were factual, truthful, observable, and not exaggerated, in ways that Romanticism sometimes could be. Romanticism was all about big emotions, sometimes tending towards the realm of fantasy. Realism was about ordinary, everyday life. Charles Dickens showed us poverty in all its unpleasant detail. Middle-class lives that were ordinary, mundane, were also depicted in fiction and theater. In Ibsen's classic play Hedda Gabler, which premiered in 1891, is simply about a bourgeois woman's unhappy marriage. Side note, a thing or a person that is bourgeois is what today we'd call middle class. They aren't rich really, but they can afford some luxuries, like employing a maid. And they care a lot about respectability. What will people think? People like this are called the bourgeoisie. This is where, thanks to African-American vernacular English, we get the expression bougie. In France, painters like Gustave Courbet began to paint ordinary working people without any sort of romantic distortion. In this painting, called The Stonebreakers, we see an old man and a young man breaking rocks. That's a hard way to make a living. In the Romantic period, they might have been characterized as noble, pure, and in touch with the earth. In realism, these people represent bigger ideas, yes, but they aren't simply symbols. They look like actual sweaty working people with all their flaws and personal particulars. The men's torn, raggedy clothing, the older man's cheerfully striped vest that might be a cast-off from a wealthier man, but that also connects him to the color of the withered grass around him. And off to one side, we see a mundane human detail, what looks like their lunch in a pail. It wasn't about what the artists felt that mattered, it was the factual details that they observed. But here's where realism crosses paths with modernism. After World War I, which ended in 1918, artists and writers distrusted the rich and important people with their grand, lofty ideas who sent the poor and middle class to die in the trenches of Europe. Check out my video about World War I and modernism. Artists began to depict people truthfully, even if that meant depicting them in unflattering ways. The way the realists saw it, the industrial mechanized world had dehumanized society, so realism focused on ordinary human beings depicted in precise, living detail. Realism showed how polite, conventional society hid an ugly side. Sinclair Lewis in Main Street wrote about an idealistic young woman in Minnesota who wants to improve her society, but is thwarted by complacent, ignorant social cliques that value conservative bourgeois conformity over all else. The main character calls them the quiet dead who are scornful of the living for their restless walking. In World War I, authors saw the savagery that ordinary men were capable of inflicting on their fellow men, so they started exploring the darker side of humanity in their work. In the U.S., for example, Theodore Dreiser wrote novels like An American Tragedy about an ordinary working-class man who is driven by selfish, destructive impulses, set up by a society that makes poor people long for things they cannot have. Impulses that readers might recognize in less desperate form within themselves. These are not noble, admirable, or important people. They're just regular people you'd pass on the street who, deep down, are capable of doing terrible things. And then another disaster hit. The Great Depression began with the stock market crash of 1929. Economies around the world collapsed, and millions of people were thrown out of work and into poverty. Food assistance programs and unemployment benefits didn't exist yet. George Steinbeck wrote in Of Mice and Men about hungry workers wandering the country searching for work. Clifford Odets wrote a play called Waiting for Lefty, in which workers who are oppressed by rich and powerful industrialists go on strike. Realistic stories of regular people. The voices of Black Americans were heard by many people for the first time in the writings of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston, among others, revealed the black perspective. Richard Wright wrote about racist societies in the South and the North. One of my favorite poems is by Claude McKay. In this poem, the speaker has to fight for his freedom, but thinks he will not survive. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. This poem was written in 1919 when lynching and race riots were common. These were realities most non-black Americans had not been aware of before. In the world of painting, realist artists depicted common people in all of their complexity. One of the most famous paintings in the United States is American Gothic by Grant Wood. It depicts a farmer and his daughter. The man looks directly at the viewer with a stern dignity, his dangerous-looking pitchfork held straight up like a lance. Because of his eye contact, he's the focal point of the picture, not the daughter who stands slightly behind him. She is no longer young, but appears to live in that house with her father. She looks off to one side. Some viewers have said she looks unhappy, maybe even grief-stricken. After all, where is her mother, the farmer's wife? What is her life like living with this hard, grim-faced man who has survived hard times with, we imagine, hard work and austerity? Maybe his grimness reflects a puritanical religious attitude that has helped him endure. Will he even allow his daughter to marry and leave the farm and leave him? That's realism in a nutshell. The subjects are common workers painted with closely observed precision. The painting hints that we should respect these people for their suffering, but also acknowledge their human flaws. Music that came from common people began to rise in importance. Whereas classical music had usually been composed by and for the upper classes, jazz and dancehall music, often produced by black artists, gained in popularity and also gained in respectability. Realism would continue to be important in the decades afterwards, like in the Italian neo-realist films of the 1940s and the British fiction plays and films of the 1950s called kitchen sink realism. This video is part of a series on modernism. I hope you'll check out the other videos in this series as well. Take care.